everybody for joining our Coffee Talk today, which is centered around transforming bank account and signatory management. I'm Jon Paquette, EVP for Solutions and Product Strategy at TIS, and I'm actually a former Treasury practitioner myself. So back in my practitioner days, I certainly dealt with this topic a lot. I know how painful it can be to manage these processes within corporates. I think this is a topic that treasurers love talking about because it's such a long-standing problem that has really never had a perfect solution. The process for managing bank account records, signatories, the bank-specific requirements, ultimately actioning and tracking those changes with your banks. It's just a painful process all the way around. And I think the market has been consistently looking for a solution to make this more simple, to take a lot of friction out of this process. And while we can't promise a fully electronic solution exists today to really manage all these aspects fully end-to-end electronically across your entire bank portfolio, I think what we are hoping to do today is really share some best practices around this topic, and also give you a sense for how technology is evolving to really be able to solve these challenges better for corporates in the future. So to help me do that, I'm very happy to have Riccardo Balsamo with me, who's the CEO of Delega. Riccardo, maybe you could take a minute here to introduce yourself as well, and even tell us a little bit about what Delega does.
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to be here with you, John, today. My name is Riccardo Balsamo. I'm the CEO and one of the founders at Delega, which is a Swiss-based fintech, whose actually mission is to digitize bank signature management. Before doing that, in my previous life, I've been working in an international bank for almost 14 years. So dealing with corporate pain point has been actually my bread and butter for many years. This is actually where one day the idea of Delega came up, because after client number 2,700 and XXX that was complaining about this, I said, okay, maybe something can be done. It should be done. And here we are, a year and a half after later, trying to get this problem out of the way.
All right, great. Thanks, Riccardo. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The problem definitely exists. I think you hear it across the board from all corporates. It's something they're definitely looking for a solution for. So before we jump into our coffee talk session, maybe we could just take a minute here to introduce also the partnership between TIS and Delega that was put in place some time ago. But really what we're looking to hope to do with this partnership is leverage the capabilities of both providers. So anybody that's familiar with TIS knows that we're a strong player in the SaaS cloud software space, particularly around bank account management and bank connectivity. So for our clients, we're already managing a lot of these processes today in terms of being the single source of truth for their bank account records, allowing them to manage signatory updates, store documentation, orchestrate workflows internally around a lot of these changes. And then, in a lot of cases, we're also the conduit to the bank, in most cases, the conduit to the bank, facilitating communication back and forth for certain information and payment files and reporting and things like that, right? So Delega on the other side, obviously, is pushing very strong in the signatory management topic and really facilitating electronic communications with the banks, put in place workflows to allow corporates to really drive those processes in a more streamlined way, drive a lot better tracking around where things stand in the process of signatory management changes, overall bring better visibility to the process and a whole lot less friction. So, we kind of feel like we have two pieces of the puzzle here in terms of the connectivity piece and the, sort of the workflow signatory management sort of technical capabilities of Delega. And obviously, Delega has a pretty strong voice in the market too. They're trying to push the banks and sort of rally the corporates to kind of push this topic internally as well. So it's going to take a lot, obviously, to put in place a really good solution to make this a holistic sort of global end-to-end process for corporates. But we think that we have a pretty strong ability to do this between the two of us here. So, Riccardo, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add there in terms of just the partnership.
Well, no, John, you said it all. I think that it kind of comes with the whole point of how can we solve it. The status quo and the past has shown that isolated attempt has not really made any breakthrough. And that's why we have decided to join forces to actually make sure that ourselves as a specialized tool we've really gone down to the deepest level of possible detail in that process, joining forces with a great player like you guys. It's a typical case that, like we always say, that where 1 + 1 can make 3. So I think indeed we have a strong case to get this problem out of the way.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm excited about what we'll be able to do in the future here for this process. As we get into our discussion points here, maybe we could just start with a very basic sort of square one type question around why is this topic so complex for corporates? Why is the bank account management, signatory management process so complex? Why is there so much friction in it today? what kind of time are corporates typically spending on this process? And in general, do you think it's across the entire industry, or do you think it's just for organizations of a certain complexity that are really dealing with this issue in general?
Well, no, that's an excellent question. Definitely, it is a kind of a cross-industry kind of problem. It doesn't matter whether you are automotive or you're a software company. This affects everybody. Obviously, it's an incremental size of your complexity and size, because the more counterparts you have, the bigger your organization is, the less fun it becomes. But it's actually a problem that affects everybody. And the problem has been, like you mentioned before, it's been historically there for a while. There are a couple of reasons, but before we move into why this problem is there, I think it's worth to mention why treasurer have a problem with that. First, it's a very critical information. Who is able to represent your company should something that should not be left to manual spreadsheets and systems that don't talk to each other, and especially in a broken process. And you've been a treasurer practitioner yourself. I've talked to treasurer for all my life. If I could have a penny for all the time I've heard that a corporate's had a person leaving, and then on the bank side, maybe the person was still up there, I would be rich by now, right? So there's definitely a risk aspect in there. There's definitely an FTE inefficiency because this whole process is very manual, especially for large organizations with many banking counterparts. Adding one person, if you have 25 banks, which is actually the norm, if you are a mid-large size organization, it could be an immensely time-consuming activity for Treasury Department. And we all know the Treasury Department nowadays are always asked to do more with less. These are teams that are always on, the thin side of the FTE. They have to be thin, they have to be agile. And with the environment that we have, where interest rates are crazy, they're going up and down, treasurer have to do strategic job. They have to do a very important strategic job. So they can't afford to, quote unquote, lose time on a manual operation, repetitive task. These things are the typical use case where technology has to step in, make their life easier so that they can do the job that they should do, which is, managing treasury, cash flow, and, taking care of all the macroeconomic environment that their job requires.
Yeah,
that's why it's so critical.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think it is a challenge for all corporates, regardless of size, regardless of geography. Obviously, as you expand into new geographies and you're using international banks, the variation in KYC requirements and documentation requirements adds an additional level of complexity on top of the whole process. But even for a simple operation that might be purely domestic, it's rare that you see a company these days that isn't multi-bank, doesn't have 4 or 5 bank relationships, right? Even if you have a credit facility, you probably have to give share a wallet to 4 or 5 banks. So right there, that might be driving the need to have multiple different bank relationships. And then right away, you start to have these complexities of managing documentation, signatory changes, keeping things in sync across multiple different bank relationships. And the story that you told is one that happened to me all the time, where you think you put in place a signatory change, and then you find out at some point in time, whether it be when you check the records with the bank yourself, or maybe when your auditors do the year-end account validations, the account reviews, that the signatories aren't who you thought they were, right? The bank never really acted on that instruction. So it's a huge pain point for corporates. And like you pointed out, big risks too, because you're talking about the individuals that have signature authority on your bank accounts to move money, to execute documents. I mean, this is a pretty important topic for corporates. So, all the more reason for why it needs to be solved for in a more streamlined way. If we were to discuss just sort of the best practices available today, so I know we're going to get into a little bit of what has sort of come into market and then come out of market as it pertains to electronic bank account management, but the stuff that's kind of stuck around, the softwares that corporates really use on a day-to-day basis to manage these topics. Maybe you could talk us through some of the best practices there. What are the right softwares to be using? What are the right workflows to have in place to at least make this a secure internal process if you can't manage that communication with the bank directly?
Sure. I mean, I've talked to many corporates trying to do something with this problem, and you have a 0, something % that they actually developed their own custom internal company tool. Majority is actually relying on finding solution in the market, either from system provider or from banks. Problem with banks is that even if they're willing to go that extra mile, they can only come up with bank proprietary solution. So I believe that that cannot come by nature from the banking industry, at least as isolated, because even if one single bank developed the most amazing tool, it's only going to work with that bank. And if you're a large corporate, you don't bank with one bank only, you have multiple banking partners. Mm-hmm. Coming to the best practice, I think what is really important is having a solution where not only there is the internal tracking of who has delegated what, who has approved the delegation of what to whom. So there's all that internal who said yes for which, and can we track it? Can we log it? Is there an easy way to access that information? But more importantly, when that information has been transmitted to the outside world, which is actually where, in my opinion, this is why we've come up with our solution, current solution have a bit of a deficit. They don't really necessarily manage the whole end-to-end process with banks, because when you have to add somebody, you first have to understand the documentation requirements, you have to act on it, you have to be able to transact and say, well, here's the document, or is this good, or is it not? And again, think about doing this change with 20 or 25 counterparts in one go. And more, and last but not least, is having a closing the loop where the bank is actually able to review your input and give you back the information of, yes, I've done it, or I haven't, and have access to that information that is equal for both parties. Because again, we go to the stage where me as a corporate, I think I have 25 people, and then the bank says probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 on the records. So there must be one, if you like, co-manage list where both the corporates and the banks can collaborate and make sure that that data is actually valid for both of them. That is, if you like, the holy grail of this market problem, being sure that if I see 25 people as a corporate, my bank sees 25 people too. And we operate and we co-manage that register together.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right there. So, bank account management solutions, software-based bank account management solutions help corporates immensely in managing these variables internally, being able to track bank account records, signatories, store all your documentation, put in place workflows around the changing of that data, so that if a signatory needs to be updated, has it been updated on your records? Have you sent the documents over to the banks? Have you done everything on your side that you need to actually initiate that change? But then the part where it seems to still fall off and is, okay, has the bank also done that? Have they actually acted on all the requests that we have? So, but I think you're right. I mean, if you put in place a good bank account management solution today, you can pretty easily run a report today, maybe say quarterly or twice a year or something like that, that says, okay, here's all of our bank account records and here's who the signatories should be, and send that out to the banks and say, can you verify that this is also what you have on records on your side? So at least you can pick out those discrepancies a little bit more easily than you would if you didn't have a software solution in place. But the onus is still on the corporates to do that, right? To be able to initiate that process, to initiate the validation process. So it's still sort of a point of friction in the process, which kind of brings to my next point here. And I think we've kind of hit on it a little bit, but kind of describing a lot of the efficiencies the markets has already been able to put in place around bank account management and what BAM solutions have done for corporates. Maybe we could talk a little bit about where the friction points still do exist for a lot of companies out there, and why this is still a less than ideal process, and why the corporates are still asking. I mean, I can tell you every time we show our bank account management solution, a lot of corporates will ask us, does it also communicate with the banks about these signatory records? And we say we would love it to, but the banks aren't sort of ready to receive that information that way. But yeah, maybe we could talk about just why the corporates are so focused on that last mile there, the communication with the bank, and why that creates so much friction in the process today.
Absolutely, and this comes hand in hand with what we just discussed about why things have not worked before in a way. Reason is quite simple. As we stated, the appetite for the solution is there. Corporates need a solution from there. There isn't been a solution so far, is that when there hasn't been a protocol, like for example with SEPA payment or with XML, there's been a protocol which has been developed for the industry that has been commonly accepted. There is no such a thing when it comes to signatory management. So there's no single standard. If we want to go to one level deeper in the details, that would require that each and every single bank would have the possibility to receive those files and adapt their backend to digest those files. And that would be an immensely huge undertake, because think about every bank going and changing their backend system. Sometimes some of those backend systems are older than me. That is not an easy undertake. So it's always been preferred to say, well, somehow it's inefficient, but we'll make it work in a manual way, which it doesn't. EBAM has been one case. There's been different actors try to solve it, and it has been always in a way a kind of a corporate to bank flow. So sender receiver. What we think is going to be the future is actually reverse that equation, where actually the corporates kind of owning the data and then collaborating with their banks, because like I said, otherwise we would have to rely on each and every backhand to be changed for a standard which today does not even exist.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I see three kind of clear points of friction in the process for corporates. One is just not being able to send that information electronically. You need to do that through like some sort of, email, secure email or something like that, right? Where it becomes a lot more difficult to track. Hey, did the receiver receive this? Did they read it? Are they acting on it? There's no sort of connection in the workflow there. The other is being able to sort of get a feedback of what the banks have on file for their records. I know there's a lot of corporates out there that would like to be able to say, okay, this is what I have. Can I pull back a version of what the bank has and do some sort of comparison sort of electronically here? And the third is just managing all the variations in documentation, KYC requirements. We hear that all the time. Every single bank is different. Every bank country it's different. How do we get some standardization around this? How do we, kind of alleviate a lot of the burden it puts on Treasury, the work it puts on Treasury to manage all these bank country specific requirements for signatory management? So it's very clear pain points I think that the corporates are seeing in the markets. And you're right. I mean, there have been initiatives to try to solve this. EBAM, everybody always asks about what happened to EBAM. Why did EBAM never take off? And I know we've talked to some corporates who have put in place sort of bank proprietary EBAM processes with a few of their cash management banks, but nothing that is really sort of universal or be able to sort of support their processes across their entire bank portfolios. So it's still, they might opt for a paper process just because they don't want to have an electronic process with one bank and then have paper processes with the other 16. It's more work for them to kind of have multiple different ways that they're managing these variables too. So, but yeah, talking about sort of EBAM a little bit more, just sort of, I guess, some of the barriers to why EBAM never really took off. I think one thing that is kind of clear that kind of emerges the way that challenges have been solved in the Treasury and software space in general is that it seems like there's no one party that's going to probably solve this entirely on their own. It's going to take multiple different parties coming together. For example, fintechs, sort of having innovative solutions that they're bringing to banks being supportive of that and adopting universal protocols. Corporates trying to push sort of what their viewpoint of what they want this process to look like into the sort of design of all this. And I just want to get your take on that. Is that the right way to think about it? You think, is it multiple parties coming together for a comprehensive solution to sort of address this problem? And what role do you think each one of those parties is kind of playing in driving a solution in the market today?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because this is actually why we created this company and the fundamental of our approach to this problem. We indeed believe that, and history has proven that isolated attempt to, namely EBAM or others, have not really worked. We mentioned the reason. Mainly it's been a bit of an inability from banks to read those EBAM files. Second, even the solution itself, I think, really miss the point that you earlier mentioned. This should not be kind of file exchange solution. I send you an instruction, there you go. This is a process. To manage the process, you need a workflow engine. This is why, before we even started writing one line of code for our application. We called up a bunch of treasurer, we called up some banks, and we put them around the table and exactly said, okay, we know history has proven this is now has not working. What do we need to do differently this time? And what kind of let's focus on the features and the business issue, and then work out our way to build an application. So we really did an almost a year and a half job of mapping the business process, understanding corporate's ambition, but also understanding and appreciating banks' challenge when it comes to local regulation, because there is and this is the ex-banker in me, there's an attitude, and sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not, where people say that banks are the bad guys, etc. But sometimes they have just to face with some regulation. It's not their fault. So you have to find a minimum common denominator between, if you like, a dream solution and a viable solution. And that's why we focus on these three aspects. Let's build a workflow engine that allows a collaboration between parties and allows for data to be shared and allows for comparison. So to make sure that my view of the data is the same view of you. And when my auditors come, I still have a mechanism to engage that workflow and make sure that your data are always in sync, so that continuous validation is there. And to the second part of your question, definitely the market should and is going to follow that, and that's why we are even here today in the market, is to gather people around the table. And when I say people, different actors. So ourselves as service provider, we have to be the catalyst of that change. We have to put corporates in working groups, working tables, or whatever you want to call them, by kind of join forces and gradually enforce that change together. So isolated attempt will not do, because everybody brings a specialty. In our case, we bring our expertise in the process side. In your case on TIS, your strengths on the connectivity. Corporates bring their requirements, and banks are the necessary actors on the other side, because this is a two-actor process. One party alone won't work. You need two parties to agree. And as a service provider, we will play, I'm 100% convinced, a key role into that. The equation where it's going to be the regulator or the banks that have to come up with something that is long gone. I think it's now on the service provider side to drive that innovation.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree completely. I think that definitely, fintechs can drive a lot of innovation into this space, working hand in hand with banks, just sort of, making this sort of a comprehensive solution for corporates. And I think you're right. I think a lot of corporates get confused about, like, why can't we just send this information today electronically? I can send payment instructions to my banks. I can pull in information reporting. I have communication channels with my banks. Why can't I just send off a signatory change request through the same channel? And it has to do with a lot of things that you just said. I mean, first of all, if you think about the recipient of that information on the receiving end for those payment instructions or the providing the information reporting, that's more like the transactional operational area of the bank. If you think about the recipient for signatory change information, that's got to go to the relationship management people. So it's almost like two completely separate departments, despite it seeming like one connection to the bank. And everybody knows, who's ever worked with a bank, how spread out banks are from an organizational standpoint, and how different people sit. And I think the other thing is definitely the authorization topic, which is a big one. Like, when a bank receives one of these change requests for signatory management, how do they know they're authorized to act on it? What's the mechanism that's telling them that, right? That's something that probably needs to be solved for and agreed universally throughout the banks itself, because I know there are a lot of banks out there right now that are struggling with that topic on just API payment instructions through API. How do we know these are authorized to act on if they come through an API call, where they have that process pretty well worked out through, say, like an SFTP OS connection already? It's still kind of in progress a little bit from that standpoint. So there are definitely a lot of concerns there. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's I think both corporates and the fintechs have seen a lot through banks and seen a lot of processes that work. They understand the true challenges too, in terms of it not just being getting information to point A to point B, but also having a workflow around that and a tracking mechanism, because that's what corporates really want around this. They want to be able to understand where these things sit in the process, not just sort of transmit instructions and still have them be lost on the receiving end and not acted on, right? So yeah, it's going to take a lot of coming together and a lot of collaboration to solve this one, but yeah, certainly we're excited to be a part of it alongside you guys. Maybe we could conclude here. I know we're kind of coming to the end of our session. Riccardo, what do you think of the big trends, sort of themes that corporates should be keeping an eye on right now in this EBAM sort of electronic signatory management space? Like, what's happening right now that's really interesting that corporates might want to pay attention to, or are there ways that corporates can get involved if this is a huge pain point for you, or like a topic that you're really, really interested in?
Sure. I mean, we touched point before on this. Unlike it in the payment space, where, for example, things like PSD2 and if we go way back, SEPA have sort of paved the way for certain standards to be followed. API is the new things now for payment. It's still not on the payment side really 100% mature, but it's a step forward in that direction. The good and bad news at the same time is that there is no such a thing when it comes to signatory management. There you have an empty space. So there is no API, there is no standard. Even obviously the regulator has not taken any stand on that side to sort of create a frame, which could be perceived as bad news. From my opinion, it's a great news, because it means that we can set the way for something that can become a standard. Okay, the reason why we have put together a solution, therefore subsequently made the partnership with TIS, is really about that. We don't have a limitation in our thinking, and we don't have a standard we need to follow. So we can set that standard, always starting from the main business problem. So we focus on the problem, and then we put the technology around it, right? So what we're doing together is not a problem looking for a solution, but it's the other way around. Therefore, we strongly believe in simplicity. We believe that good things can be simple. They don't have to be complicated. Host to host is a perfectly viable way, for example, for transmitting information to banks. People talk about API and this fancy stuff, but what you need to focus is, how do I transmit something do I have a way to transmit in a secure manner my information on the other side, on the bank side? And the answer is yes. The second part is, okay, I don't have a form, I don't have a structure that all the banks will accept. Well, we don't need a structure, we don't need a format. As long as we're able to present information in an easy to understand way, to your point, these are not payment. They don't go to a back office instruction MT101 kind of standard format. These are information that are read by a human being. So they need to be understandable by a human being. So we made that information very, very easy to consume for a human being, and being able for that same very human being to tell from banks to the corporate, yes, okay, that is okay, or that is not okay. I need more, I need that document, I need less. Because at the moment is a human to human interaction, as long as the result of that interaction is a structured data that everybody can see and can rely on, right? So, and that's a philosophy of our partnership, and then that's what we're trying to achieve in the future, is to build and be the new standards, keeping in mind that this is not that complex if you think about it, really.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more with that. A simple data exchange of sort of what the corporate's looking to do, sort of an acknowledgement of the receipt, a workflow around this. I think it's all a lot simpler than maybe the traditional approaches that focus more on proprietary protocols and things like that maybe really took, and that could be a big reason why those never really took off. And I think one of the strengths of the fintechs too, that we can be a lot more flexible in that respect and how we deliver information to banks if they need to receive it a certain way, right? That's kind of the role that we typically play, and sort of connecting up corporates with banks anyway. So it's a natural way for us to sort of, kind of evolve this process as well. So
absolutely.
And this kind of brings us to the end of the discussion track, but I know we have quite a few listeners on the line here today. So maybe I'll call on Jen here and see if any questions came in from the audience during the course of the session that Riccardo and myself could answer.
Sure thing. Hi, John. Yes, we did have a couple questions roll in. The first one comes in from Eli. Do open banking APIs have the potential to improve the EBAM process? I'd like to take that one.
Yeah, I can take that. one, it's I guess it's a bit of a loaded question because obviously open banking APIs, I don't think there's any sort of limit to how sophisticated they could potentially get over time. But if you were to sort of look at that today in terms of what they might be able to enable, and even in the near term, probably take a look at sort of where banks are currently on the API journey. A lot of really focused on just getting their bank reporting and transaction reporting APIs off the ground, right? That's sort of the big initiative around most US banks. And then step 2 for most banks is more around payment initiation APIs and real-time payments. Kind of has gone a little bit further in Europe than it has in the US, and in Asia as well, and US is still sort of kind of playing catch up there. So to think about like the third iteration of the evolution of those APIs in terms of enabling true bank account management functionality, I'd have to imagine there's quite a bit of work there for banks to do to be able to really facilitate that. That being said, we've sat in a lot of different peer groups and things like that with banks, with our customers, and I know one API functionality that's being pushed hard for from the corporates would be the ability to initiate an API call out to the banks and receive back a listing of their bank account records and signatories, basically as a way to sort of call for information and receive information, right? And that could be a really good application for open banking APIs if banks are able to adopt that in the, say, relatively near term once they get the payments piece squared away. But if you're talking about some of the stuff that Riccardo and myself have kind of been discussing during the course of the conversation, such as actually initiating requests to change a signatory on a bank account, I feel like that's a different topic, right? And like we had talked about before, you wouldn't need to just think about the passing of the information, the request, to really solve that problem for corporates. You also need the visibility, the workflow, sort of all that aspect of it as well. So I don't know if that directly answers that question or not. It's a maybe, but I think that there's probably a better near-term solution that could be pursued in this space that would solve things probably a little more effectively for corporates through maybe a simpler protocol, I guess.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, the next question comes in from Nadav. What steps do you recommend to get started?
You want me to go, John?
Yeah, you can take this one.
All right. Look, in following up on your point about API could be a way or not, Rome wasn't built in a day. And I think that from what we are undoubtedly hearing from the market, from corporates, people are a bit tired of waiting for something which maybe it looks like a Ferrari, but it actually are still kind of nowhere on a solution. So the desire is to have something that is actually working or workable in the short term. With a clear objective, yes, to have the dream scenario or the best scenario as an ultimate goal. But from our end, we're really talking to a lot of corporates that says, all right, give me something that is, even if it's not 100% perfect, 100% is okay, but I'm at 0 now. If you give me something that takes me to 75%, I'll be happy, even less. But we got to start somewhere, and this is why we've believed that now it's time for players like us and corporates to come to a practical and pragmatic table and discuss option. We do have a proposition that we want to get corporates to know that there's a new way to do it, and I think Delega and TIS are doing a great job together to foster that new option. And so the immediate next step is to don't be afraid to sort of roll up your sleeve and go, right? This is a market where we need to pursue changes, and changes doesn't come along. We as service provider, we're happy to be the catalyst, but we also need you guys on the corporate side to work with us. More importantly, because we need to have a real clear understanding of, are we really helping? Is this what we're doing really, really helping? What are we missing? We want to hear to you. We want to hear from what you need. And then together, once we are all on the same page, which it's key, then we can all together go and talk to the banks, because I think they are a very important part of this equation. But they should be called in when we have a list, sort of a proposition to make. And I think Delega and TIS together are now ready for that proposition to be started. And so the next thing to do is to sort of engage in a collaborative way and start discussing practical, viable option on how to get this problem solved one piece at a time.
Great, thank you, Riccardo. Okay, the final question comes in from Maya. Are there any councils or industry groups you would recommend joining?
Yeah, so I can take one. So there, I mean, there are certainly a few that have emerged over the years. I think there are, you know, some banking group sort of committees that that meet and sort of discuss protocols, as well as, you know, corporates, you know, who would be interested in maybe adopting them, providing things in more of a peer group fashion. I think Swift did something a number of years back as well. But yeah, I mean, I think you know, probably the best advice we could give in this topic, I think, is sort of what Riccardo said in the last response there, is to just get involved. You know what I mean? A little bit. There's a lot of groups out there, particularly working with fintechs and things like that, where you know, people are really looking for input from the corporates in terms of what they're looking for a solution here. I think there's a good recognition, particularly within the fintech space, that this challenge is inconsistent across all corporates. All corporates face different challenges depending on sort of the banks and things that they work with. And we want to solve the problem, the sort of the quintessential problem at hand, which is the exchange, tracking, and visibility around the signatory management. But you need a lot of input from a lot of different sources to really be able to do that effectively. So I know that, you know, Delega and TIS, obviously, we're actively collecting feedback from customers in terms of how they'd like to see this process be. We're encouraging corporates to also push their banks if they really want to see, you know, these processes put in place. I think one thing that's, you know, we can kind of draw a parallel to a little bit is the adoption of APIs and sort of the way that's come about in different markets. And in Europe, it was very driven by government mandates like PSD2, right? That sort of advanced open banking protocols in Europe a lot faster than other markets like the US. In the US, it was all organic. It was the corporates going to their banks and saying, we want these, you know, build these APIs, open up this functionality for us. And I think the same thing could happen with e-banking protocols and things like signatory management. It's the strongest voices are a group of corporates coming together collectively and really saying to their banks, this is something we want you guys to explore. So in terms of getting started and having a voice in the matter, I think that's a great way to be able to ultimately do that.
Great, thanks so much, John. Before I hand this back to you, if anyone has any questions or wants to continue the conversation, you can always connect with John or Riccardo on LinkedIn, or you can email us at info@tspayments.com. So thank you, and John, back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, John, and thanks everybody for those questions. Those are great ones. Hope you guys really enjoyed the session that we put on here today. Riccardo, thanks again for agreeing to join this coffee talk. Always an interesting topic to discuss. I think the market is super interested in any sort of solution that's driving at a better process for signatory and bank account management. So I'm sure we had a lot of interested listeners. You know, if anybody's interested in following up on this topic after the coffee talk, Riccardo and myself are always available too. Feel free to reach out through email, LinkedIn. We're happy to connect, chat about, you know, what we're seeing in the market, or, you know, if anybody is interested in sort of getting involved more in some of these initiatives, we could kind of point you in the direction of a good way to do so. But yeah, overall, Riccardo, thanks a lot. Great conversation, I thought.
My pleasure. It's been a great talk. We're looking forward to get this problem out of the way. Thanks again for having me.
All right, thanks everybody again. We hope we see you on our next coffee talk, and enjoy the rest of your day.